Hello, good morning. So today we will be starting our discussion of chapter 2. And in chapter 2, what Judith Butler basically talks about is psychoanalysis. She talks about psychoanalysis and she talks about the way in which prohibition, repression is a very important part of the way in which gender identity is constructed. So that is broadly the focus that Judith Butler has. Almost all of the chapter is going to be an engagement with either Freud or with Lacan. So these are the two primary psychoanalysts that Judith Butler will be engaging with. There will be two concepts that she is going to focus primarily on, and the concepts are mourning and melancholia, or mourning and melancholy. And these two concepts she is going to use in order to foreground her theory of where she believes that Lacan and Freud may be read in a manner that is going to reveal their either conscious or unconscious heteronormative bias. So that is broadly the way in which she is going to construct her argument. Now, she begins the chapter by saying that many feminists basically say that, oh, I think it would be a good idea to go in search of a point in history before patriarchy. And she says that this investigation into a point in time before patriarchy is not going to be very, very useful because the story of origins is something that patriarchy also believes in. So therefore, going into the same story of origins is perhaps not going to be very, very useful. Patriarchy is then going to say that yes, of course, there was a time before patriarchy. Oh, but you must understand that patriarchy happened spontaneously. So the moment you say that patriarchy happens spontaneously, there seems to be a sense of almost naturalness, that it is organic. See, we didn't have to do anything. It just evolved like that. And I don't think this is terribly useful, because then patriarchy is going to say, well, this was bound to happen because, this is what it is, pure and simple. So this production of culture as pure and simple, this production of society as pure and simple is not a very good idea, because what we think of as simple is very often not very simple, but very varied and very complex. And she begins the chapter by talking about Levi-Strauss. And we all know the way in which Levi-Strauss talks about culture and nurture, and he talks about the raw and the cooked. And Judith Butler says that this is very, very interesting because, even when this talk of nature and culture is being carried out, in an astonishing way, nature is already being produced as female and culture is being produced as male. So there is some kind of a gender binary that is already being built into our discussion of nature and culture. So therefore, Judith Butler says that it is not as though, nature was once raw and then it became cooked. She, in her own inimitable way, is saying that maybe what we think of as raw is already cooked. So there is a way in which she is questioning the whole notion of the organic, of the natural, of the simple, and she's saying that these notions perhaps need to be investigated. Then she moves on to Levi-Strauss. And when she talks about Levi-Strauss, she says that Levi-Strauss also, he starts off his life as you all know, he starts off life as an anthropologist, and I'm sorry, he starts off life as a philosopher and then moves on to anthropology. But even when he moves into anthropology, Judith Butler detects that certain philosophical structures still remain embedded in Levi-Strauss. they don't go away somehow, and I think that is something which clearly is a problem over here. And then we come to the way in which Ferdinand de Saussure, yes, so we come to Saussure, and Saussure, you know this very well, those of you who are even remotely familiar with linguistics, that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. But even though it is arbitrary, we somehow don't seem to worry about it too much. We somehow don't seem to worry about the arbitrariness of it. So there is a way in which both Lévi-Strauss and Saussure and all the others who are very, very structuralist, they are positing a kind of structure where there is nothing natural, nothing normal about it. It is all very carefully produced, and yet we don't seem to be having any problems with it. So this is where post-structuralism comes in, and post-structuralism talks about différance. And when post-structuralism talks about différance, what basically happens is that this whole sort of structure that is created gradually begins to show itself as being very fragile, as being very precarious. And that is something which I think post-structuralists home in on, and they decide that this is something which we should be concentrating on. She goes on to talk about Luce Irigaray, and when she talks about Irigaray, she focuses primarily on the way in which Irigaray talks about the women as goods. She cites the exchange and distribution of women as an example very much of not only homosociality. Now, homosociality is a concept that many of you may already be aware of, which is, what is homosociality? Homosociality is broadly a structure where one sex marks that group. Yeah, so therefore, a men's football team, for example, or a boys' hostel, or indeed till very recently the army, sex segregated prisons. So therefore, homosocial spaces are those spaces where only men live or only men operate. That is broadly homosociality. But this is where also Judith Butler shows off her knowledge of French a little bit. And when she is using Luce Irigaray, she says that yes, this is not only homosociality, but this is also homosociality. I'll say that again. This is homosociality. Now, homosociality is, of course, it's a pun on both homosociality and the French word for man, which is homme, H-O-M-M-E. So homosociality is spelled as H-O-M-M-O-S-O-C-I-A-L-I-T-Y. So homosociality. So therefore she says that this is basically all about men. And when Claude Lévi-Strauss is talked about later, Lévi-Strauss says that this is all, Claude Lévi-Strauss says that this is all very good. This is all very desirable, because this also prohibits incest, and Claude Lévi-Strauss famously says, and of course the prohibition against incest is so powerful that it has never been committed. Okay. So Lacan believes that this repression of incest structures not only the structures of kinship, but also language. So therefore, by the end of the first section of the second chapter, Judith Butler manages to establish that language is marked by repression. That much is very, very clear. And when we go on to the second section, this is where Judith Butler engages with Lacan's idea of being the phallus and having the phallus. Now, this is something that many of you may already be aware of, because according to Lacan, phallus, that is to say patriarchal power, Lacan says that women are the phallus and men have the phallus. So woman is the being of the phallus and man is the having of the phallus. And this is something which, of course, we are familiar with, because it is also something that Hegel talks about, doesn't he? When he talks about the master-slave dialectic, you can't have a master if you don't have a slave. So therefore, in order for phallus to operate, phallus also needs to have an embodiment of its power. So the embodiment of patriarchal power is the woman, but the patriarchal power is practiced in a disembodied way by the men. That is something that we are already quite aware of. Also, Judith Butler then goes on to say that how do women therefore embody patriarchy? Well, women embody patriarchy through masquerade. That is what is being suggested over here, is that women embody patriarchy through masquerade. Now, what is masquerade? Masquerade is also hiding something, but hiding itself too. So masquerade is evading identification. So the question that is being asked over here is masquerade hiding an inner femininity, or is it excluding masculinity when a woman is masquerading? So therefore, what exactly is being hidden in the performance of masquerade? Is there some such thing as an inner femininity that is being hidden? Or what is merely being done is that some kind of what is regarded as masculinity is being disavowed, it is being denied? Is that what is happening? So by the time we come to the middle of the second section, what becomes very clear is that identity, and this is something that I would want you to come back to later in case you have any doubts about it. Identity is structured through refusal. And I would want you to keep that in mind subsequently as well. We are because what we are not, or what we say we are not. So therefore, it isn't so much as what we are as what we are not. So therefore, our identities are constantly structured on the basis of I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this. And there is no end to the not thisness, because of course there are a million things that we have to constantly differentiate ourselves against in order to prove who we are. So therefore, identity is not what we are, but identity is what we are not. So therefore, whether you are talking about yourself as a man, or whether you're talking about yourself as a woman, or whether you're talking about yourself as a trans, you are basically saying, I am not this, I am not this, I am not this. And I think it is, so therefore there are several disavowals that are happening, right? There are several denials that are happening. There are several, well, this is what we shall address in the next video, several repressions are happening. And it is through these repressions, these denials, these abjections, Julia Kristeva, but that will come later, through which we are primarily structuring our identity. So our identity is not what we are, our identity is what we are not. So it is on several negatives on which our identity is based. And how those negatives are basically repressions, that is something which we shall talk about in our next video.